Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Unfiltered Vet Discussions. My name is Kelly, and I'm being joined by Jenny, Phil, and David today. You can read all about our wonderful selves if you are so inclined at unfilteredvetdiscussions.com. We are also on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. So please come join us, and we'd actually really love to hear your comments and get some conversations going back and forth. So today we have the topic of the cat couldn't say sorry. What the heck does that mean? The cat couldn't say sorry. So we're going to kick that off about it. And Jenny, you were actually kind of talking to us a little bit about this. And then we're like, ooh, yeah, this is a good one. Yep.
So it just reminds me because last time we recorded, David was trying to get his cat into the carrier for a vet appointment and came back like with blood.
Right.
I don't think your cat wowould say he was sorry either. So
No.
my kids were big readers in my family, and we used to read this book called Tumford the Terrible. And Tumford was a kitty who got into a lot of trouble. And one of the quotes from the book is, in spite of the manners he often forgot, he would not say, I'm sorry. Oh no, he would not. And the whole book is all about how even though Tumford made bad choices sometimes, he just couldn't say he was sorry, and how hard it is to get those words out sometimes. And I think that it's really hard to admit when we make a mistake, and when and and then not just admit like, yeah, we made a mistake. I had one of my team members who maybe didn't do something that was very professional, and her response was, oh, my bad. And I'm like, that's not an apology, and you were in
Right.
the wrong. And so not only is it what words you use, how do you say you're sorry, but so how do we avoid being like Tumford? How do we say we're sorry? Phil, I think you had a story about this.
I do. So, and very much like Tumford as a 34-year-old, a grown individual, I finally learned, the some of the process of that. And so what's interesting is when we look at forgiveness, and well-being, when we look at forgiveness and resilience, it's a really powerful tool, but just like Tumford, we have a really hard time with it. And so I had a situation. So I mentioned here is that, I'm in long-term recovery from alcohol and substances, and there's a process, and depending on what way you choose to, or way you hope to get it improved and better. But in 12-step recovery, there's this process that we go through, and you end up making amends to the people that you've wronged. And that I remember seeing that list on the wall, and I was like, oh, no, absolutely not. Like, I'm not doing that. The wonderful thing is that those steps are in order. And so I didn't have to do that. Step 9, by the way, for anybody keeping track at home. But luckily, it's not the first one. um, but what happened is there was a situation where I ended up needing to make amends for something that I'd done before I got to that process. And what's interesting, so my sponsor was a veterinary internist, and he asked me, he said, okay, here's what I'm going to have you do. I want you to write down in a letter what you did, where you were wrong, and find out what can you do to make it better. What can you do for that person to make it better? And he goes, under no circumstances do I want you to say I'm sorry. And I remember getting like, I got mad. Like, I'm a grown human being. Like, I don't need to write a letter. Like, this is foolish. I wrote the letter and said I'm sorry 5 times in the letter. And he was like, he was, he's like, didn't I just, he's like, what part of that, didn't you get? And I realized like how, like, the self-awareness of why is it so hard for me to just go to another human being and say, this, I was wrong. I did these things wrong, without any, period, end sentence, no explanation of here's why, know, this is that I did these things that caused you harm. I need to know what I can do to make that right. And that's it. And that was a foreign, 34 years old. It's a foreign concept to me. And even today, so, I was just sharing, like, I went through that, yesterday at work. Here it is, I know, I know better. But I'm a human being, and, got fired up, and some stuff happened, and I know why it happened, but it doesn't excuse the behavior. Is that I do have to do things to unscrew the light bulb or screw it back in or whatever. I almost said something else, but
But Phil, I think what you have a point there. First of all, the apology is hard because we have to own it ourselves, and we have to have that conversation with ourselves first before we can externalize it, right? Like,
right.
I have to admit my train went off the tracks about 2 miles down the road, and I can't keep the train on the tracks and pretend, because everybody knows it. Everybody knows your train went off the track. Even if you're trying to
Right.
say it didn't go off the track, the train went off the track, right? And the second bigger piece is what you were saying in there. It's just the factual piece, not the emotional piece. I mean, I think
Right.
sometimes when we get apologized, we have so many negative emotions swirling in us. We hit the defensive button really hard.
Mhm.
And we just
100%.
spew emotions out there as a defensive smokescreen versus
Yeah.
saying, like you said, this is what happened. This was my part in it. This is how I'm making it better. I mean, we have to do that with people, our loved ones, our clients,
Mhm.
our friends. But when you get the emotional defense screen in there, then it really mucks it up, because now you got a bigger
Yeah.
problem, right?
Yeah.
And the emotions are blended with excuses, and
Yeah.
providing an excuse belittles, I think, the accountability and
Right.
the responsibility to apologize. I remember one of those teachable moments that we encounter. I was waiting tables, and this must have been in college. I don't remember the event, but something akin to spilling a glass of water. And it was a couple, and I spilled, oh, sorry about that. And just flew right out. Sorry about that. And the gentleman of the couple just looked at me and said, "That's not an apology." And I heard him, but my first was like, but I was like,
Right.
"You're right. I am sorry." Because sorry about that, or like, Jenni, my bad. Those are
My
not
bad.
apologies. That's not saying
Yeah.
I recognize I made an error. I am sorry. I apologize. It's a I statement to take that accountability and take ownership for what you did or did not do.
Yeah.
I
Have you?
think this
Absolutely.
Oh, go
this is
ahead.
a
Go
conversation
ahead.
that I had with my team member that texted at 3 o'clock in the morning because she wasn't feeling well, and texted 3 people and said, "I'm not coming in. I don't feel well," at 3 in the morning. Now, we're a 24-hour on call practice. That woke everybody up. And then my team members, I either don't wake up or I go back to sleep. I'm like, listen, if I'm on call, you better call me. A text is not waking me up. But my other 2 texts did not go back to sleep. And they had a 10-hour shift that day. And so they were really upset about this. And it was exactly that. Oh, my bad. And then, well, this is why I did it. I wasn't feeling well. I wasn't thinking da 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 da. And then, well, why are you so, and then they called, one of the texts was like, don't text at 3 o'clock in the morning. And the girl who did it was like, you didn't even ask how I was doing, and like tried to flip it around like it was the other person's fault. It's like, no, 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 no. You need to own your part in this. And that's the hardest part for all of us, I think, is, whoa, what did I do? And not just the excuses that I have, but then to say, well, you were a part of this too. I tell my team all the time, you cannot control other people. You
Oh,
cannot control other people. So even if it was the situation, Phil, where yesterday you had your diva moment and you were, all
Mhm.
up in arms about something, and maybe it was because somebody else did something that set you off or whatever. You can't control that other person, right? You have to control yourself. And I think we get so in the habit of, yeah, I'm sorry, but
Mhm.
you did this. or this was the situation. And it's that stop before the but part. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And the words don't matter if you don't change your actions. And that's my big
Well,
thing. My
that's the,
kids,
yeah.
yeah, my kids do it all the time. Oh, Ma, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I don't want, and I have told my children, I don't want to hear I'm sorry. Because if you keep telling me you're sorry, that you're not putting the socks in your laundry hamper and the dog keeps eating the socks, and then we have to do a foreign body surgery on the dog, you weren't really sorry. And even if I make you pay for that foreign body surgery, I'm guessing you're still not going to be sorry until you stop, until you start putting your socks in the laundry hamper, right? Like it's the change of action that is the true apology
Yeah.
in my view.
The ones that
There's,
drive me nuts are the apologies that are not apologies. That I'm sorry that you feel that way, or
yeah.
that you reacted to this that way. Or the politicians are masters and
Mhm.
celebrities that get caught doing things of apologizing without apologizing. And that's frustrating. I cut you off, Phil. What were you?
Well, no, I was just going to say, because it is complicated, is that there can be in that situation, in a lot of these situations, is there can be a misinterpretation or a response or something like that. The difference is that I have to own my part. Well, I'll say for me, like in this process, is that I have to look through it and own my part and then stop. And if that other person, if they have some self-awareness or they go through it and they're like, you know what, I realized that I did this as well. I mean, that's beautiful. And that's two people, growing together, but it really doesn't, to Jenni's point, is it doesn't have to do with me. Like we talk about keeping our side of the street clean. As I just got to try to do the best that I can. And, there's a guy in our group that he says, when it comes to amends, or making things right, he goes, when they amended the Constitution, they didn't say I'm sorry to it. They changed it. They changed the behavior. And what was funny is this was probably about 12 years ago, 10, something like that. And I was going to a friend of mine who's in, kind of in my spiritual board of directors, if you will. And I was like, oh, I'm like, I've had to make amends to this person 3 times. And he goes, why don't you try stop being an, an a-hole? And, and I was like, and so where I'm coming from that is, one, absolutely right. The second thing was, though, is that where it came for me is I realized the state that I was in when I had to make these amends. And so this is going to get a little deep, but when we start talking about childhood trauma, when we start talking about, people that have toxic behaviors, I will say is that in defense of people in that realm, and I will say that I was one of those people as well, or still can be, is that knowing that there's parts of our brain that just handle stress differently than maybe a normal person. Like it's just heightened. That, however, does not give me an excuse to act that way. But it did give me curiosity to say, wow, this is like these things were going on when that happened. And it's really hard when I'm all the way up here to not act that way. So it was like, oh, what are the things? So instead of worrying about up here, is like 3 steps below, like what can I do to not get up there in the first place? And so
Good
that's
point.
where we started talking about scheduling. We started talking about other things that I could see did play a part, in amping up that stress, which weren't always necessarily, on me. It was a, kind of a human thing. And so that was very helpful for me to really look deep and say, okay, yes, I know that I act this way, or that I have the propensity to do this because of these things, but it's not an excuse, but I have to be aware of it and how it affects other people around me. And so what I'll say is I think I do a much better job than I used to, but I'm not immune to it, and so it's just, it's a work in progress. But that's one of the things that I do try to share with, some people, especially like when folks will be like, oh, that, well, that's just the way I am. And it's like, no, like you don't get to, like, that's not our behavior towards other people is not, we're not carte blanche. It's up to me to be able to be open to be understanding. and give that gift. But, it's like if someone's a jerk or has behaviors that aren't suitable for the workplace, I mean, that can be a challenge. So anyhow,
I think when you
yeah,
said that's the way that I am, it's
yeah,
the same as saying,
same
well, that's
as
the way we've always
right.
done it,
Yeah.
in a
Yep.
practice. Well, that's the way we've always done it. Well, that doesn't mean that it's the right way to do it. And
Mhm.
another point that you made that I think is so important is that we are all human. And I think
Yeah.
that it is hard. Like I read books to better myself. What am I working on right now? It's about mindset, changing your mindset. But I'm always working on these books and I get all wound up about it and I tell my family and stuff like that. And then of course I move on to another book. And so then I'm focused on something and I kind of forget some of those things on the book that I read
Yeah.
like 2 or 3 books ago. And my kids are like, well, Mom, remember when you were all excited about this and now you're not doing it? And I'm like,
Mhm.
but it's true because
Right.
you can only hold so much. We're all human. We're all going to
Yeah.
make mistakes. And when we talk about forgiveness and how important it is, we also have to forgive ourselves when we do blow up, when
Mhm.
we do have a moment.
Yeah.
My moments tend to come with my children. God bless them, but ooh, do they know how to push my buttons? And which I think all kids do with parents, but it's like, they just and it's hard because then I feel guilty and I'm like, I'm a horrible mom. But the reality of it is we're people. And I every now and then I have to joke about it. And I'm like, my oldest, who we've been through a lot of mental health struggles with, will say, Mom, this is childhood trauma, jokingly. And I'm like, well, honey, what else are you going to talk to your therapist about when you're older? Like, I'm just trying to give you some content to have. And she's like, oh, thanks.
Yeah.
But the reality of it is we have to forgive ourselves as we forgive other people. And I just
Yeah.
that's hard too.
It's hard too,
Mhm.
but kind of listening to all this, and we're kind of getting to the end here, but I do have a question for everybody in the room. When you do own it, when you do call it, when you don't put up a defensive shield, right, of emotions or questions back or deflecting, whatever you want, call it a defensive shield. And you say to the person that's across from you, or be it a client or a staff member or family members or a friend, and you just pull it back and you go, nope, you're right. I did that. What have you noticed has happened with the response back? I can tell you mine. Mine is it totally deflates the whole process.
Mm.
Like it takes an escalating moment and I get some double eye blinks. I get some silence back because they're not expecting that. They're expecting to have to defend themselves with
Right.
saying, no, you hurt me because you messed up. And when I say, no, you're right, I did do that. And I get that out of the gate. What have you guys found? Same?
David?
I think you're right. If it's an adversarial situation, it can diffuse it. If it's an ongoing relationship, like between staff members or staff and client, can actually build the relationship because you're reinforcing some confidence and trust that, hey, we're going to treat each other appropriately and fairly. And I'm demonstrating that by saying, I made a mistake. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And I think it can shore up a foundation in that relationship when admitting that to clients builds a huge component of that when there are pet or animals involved, because now it's not just the two of you, it's the two of you and something that someone in the room cares deeply about. That adds complexity and kind of building that relationship. We want to be trusted advisors and build that
Yeah.
kind of relationship. And part of that, when your advisor says, hey, I made a mistake in that relationship, I think depending on the mistake, but I think it can build the relationship.
Well, I think we
Yeah.
talked about psychological. Oh, sorry. We talked about psychological safety a lot. And what
Mhm.
I have noticed is as a boss, as an owner, when I screw stuff up, and we'll be in front of at a team meeting, and I'll say, guys, I have not been here for the last month. I have had a lot going on. I apologize. So I am going to, these are the steps that I'm going to take to try and do better. It has allowed them to say to me, hey, Jenni, I screwed this up. Hey, Jenni, I made this mistake. Hey, Jenni, they know they're not going to get yelled at because Simon and I make mistakes too. They know that we're not going to be like, what the hell, and blow up at them, because we recognize that they're humans, and they recognize that we're humans too, which gives us a little cushion. Everybody always thinks like the owner has to have all the answers right then.
Oh, that's right.
Right. We don't.
Good point.
Don't, no.
And so when we talk about psychological safety, one of the core concepts is that as leaders, from a leadership point of view, which has a huge impact on psychological safety, is that we have to be vulnerable first and often. And now that doesn't mean that I come into the room and go, I have no idea what's going on. I've tried myself to, not necessarily that, but also saying, I made the wrong decision here, and this is what I'm going to try to do to make it right. And you're exactly right, Jenni, is that opens up the door, and very much, David, and this is what you were alluding to too with the vulnerability, is it just feels to bear ourselves open. It's uncomfortable, but with that uncomfortable feeling, the interesting thing, and Brene Brown talks about this, is that vulnerability, sometimes it feels like it's fear, or can potentially feel like weakness. And the opposite thing is true, is that if we were to ask people, when someone was being vulnerable and sharing that, is that they would see that as courage. And it's interesting that there's still that separation, in the power of vulnerability, and the belief around it. So, yeah.
So with that, I think we're going to end today.
Yeah.
You can pick this up at a later podcast, but gosh, we covered a lot of territory today, But the cat who couldn't say sorry is where we started off with. And I think we all agree that you need to say sorry and you mean it, not just a backhanded sort of slang maneuver for it, right? And brush it off. And that the other person feels heard, and that you're honest with yourself first, and you forgive yourself, and you love yourself unconditionally, is what really forgiveness is, so that you can do that, right? And that you cannot control anybody else but yourself. So I think that's a fairly good summary. Anybody else want to add anything else? Or
I was just going to say, so in Tumford the Terrible, it says, after an incident with the queen of the fair, he finds the courage to say, I'm sorry. And in true Tillman style, that's the author, Tumford the Terrible is beautifully illustrated and reassuring for little ones, reminding them that, quote, love isn't measured in muddy galoshes, broken tea dishes, or trampled on squashes, which means it's okay. You can say you're sorry and still be loved.
So Tumford learned, we can all learn.
Yeah.
If a cat can learn something, then there's hope for all of us.
Right.
Yeah.
well, thank you, everybody, and we will see you next time. Talk to you later.